This is a flaw question, so we want to find the conclusion and then the premises and talk about why the premises don't guarantee the conclusion. What do they do wrong or what do they leave out? And the conclusion is here at the bottom. We got a because, which is a premise indicator, and the it is clear is our conclusion indicator. And the whole point here is that oxen-free prepackaged meals are nutritious. And the evidence for that is that the Connerly report says that they aren't. But the Connerly report is commissioned by Oxenfree's biggest rival. So according to the Connerly report, these prepackaged meals are not nutritious, but there's some potential for bias here. Now, there's a little bit of ad hominem going on. Just because there's possible bias doesn't mean that there's definite bias, right? So we're assuming that this Connerly report is definitely biased. But even if it were, there's a bigger problem here, right? So it says that these meals are not nutritious, and the evidence is this report. Now, if you take that evidence away, that doesn't suddenly mean that the meals are now nutritious. When you take away the evidence for a point of view, in this case, this was the conclusion of the Connerly report, we lost the evidence because it's a biased report. We're not going to pay attention to it. That doesn't mean that we then get to conclude the opposite. That's the absence of evidence fallacy. It's like somebody makes an argument, they have a premise and a conclusion, you destroy their premise, you take away their evidence, but that doesn't mean you get to conclude the opposite of their conclusion. What that means is you're back to square one. When you take away the evidence for a point of view, you don't get to conclude the opposite of that view. You have to go back to, now we don't know either way. And so the bigger problem here, beyond the ad hominem aspersions on the Connerly report, is that we're engaging in an absence of evidence fallacy. We're assuming that if the Connerly report is biased, then the opposite of its conclusion must be true. Let's go ahead and look for an answer choice along these lines, and if I don't see one along these lines, I'll look for something that sounds close to an ad hominem fallacy. Answer choice A sounds pretty good here. We're treating evidence that there is an apparent bias, and the evidence for the bias, by the way, is this whole idea that Danto gets to approve the Connerly report before it comes out, and Danto is the biggest rival to Oxenfree. So there's the potential for bias, right? But we're treating that as evidence that these claims are false. And when you see bias in somebody's evidence, or you take away somebody's evidence, you don't get to conclude that their claims are false. You don't get to say the opposite of their conclusion. That's what the absence of evidence fallacy looks like. Instead, you need to go back to square one. You need to say, well, the Connerly report is biased, so now we can't be sure whether Oxenfree's meals are nutritious or not. We got to go back and do another study or something. But we don't get to conclude that they are nutritious just because the evidence that said they weren't is suspect. That's the absence of evidence fallacy. And so that's why A is a right answer. Let's take a look at these other ones and talk about why they're no good, though. So are we drawing a conclusion based solely on an unrepresentative sample of Oxenfree products? Well, I'm not really sure what products we looked at. Did we look at their frozen chicken dinners? Did we look at their Hot Pockets? I don't know. I don't remember hearing which. We just said they're prepackaged meals, but there's no suggestion that we looked at the worst ones or the least healthy. We didn't just look at the pizzas or something. And pizza can be healthy. I'm not talking bad about pizza. Pizza's great. But we don't know what sample of products we checked, and so there's no suggestion that we went after the worst ones. Fails to consider the possibility is a weakened lead-in. So in order to like whatever follows it, it's got to be damaging. And this says Oxenfree has just as much motivation to create negative publicity for Danto as Danto has for Oxenfree. So they both don't like each other. They're both motivated against each other, but that's not damaging to the argument. We already knew that Danto was the biggest competitor to Oxenfree. We already knew that they had motives against them. We acknowledged the potential bias already. And so answer choice C isn't weakening this argument, and it would have to because it's got this weakened lead-in here. Anytime they say fails to consider the possibility or ignores the possibility, fails to provide evidence that Danto's prepackaged meals are not more nutritious. We don't have to talk about Danto's meals. It's not a comparison. We're not saying Oxenfree is better than Danto or worse than Danto, so we don't need to provide any evidence. This is true. We didn't provide any evidence about Danto's prepackaged meals, but this is not the problem. Because it wasn't a comparative conclusion, we don't need to talk about Danto's nutritional value. And finally, this is a necessary lead-in. When they say presumes without justification, whatever comes next has to be necessary. Danto's public relation department would not approve a draft report that was hostile to Danto foods. No, we're sort of assuming that Danto is gonna make Oxenfree sound worse, or they're gonna lead to bias towards Oxenfree. But we don't know what they would do if there was a negative review of Danto food products, right? This is out of scope. This report doesn't exist. There's no report out there that said anything bad about Danto. And so we don't need to assume that the public relations department would or wouldn't approve it, because this situation didn't come up, and so we don't need to make any assumptions about it. And presumes means assumes, right? So we're not making this assumption. We don't need this assumption. And so answer choice A is the one you want to get into.